Some stories start with a gunshot, others with a goodbye. But this one, it began with a girl who couldn't speak, and a man who'd forgotten how to listen. She played the piano like it was the only language left in the world. He carried a guitar like it was a ghost on his back. One had no voice, the other had no faith. And somewhere between broken notes and a barroom storm, they found something louder than words each other. This isn't a love story the way folks like to tell it. There's no perfect kiss, no easy ending, but it's got thunder. It's got music that bleeds, and it just might teach you what it means to be heard when the world stops listening. What would you do if love came in silence, and only a melody could save you? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let's see how this story plays out. The wind, a relentless beast born of the high plains, howled down the narrow, rutted main street of Redemption Gulch, flinging needles of ice and snow against the rough-hewn clapboard of the Rusty Spur Saloon. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer, cheap whiskey, wood smoke, and unwashed bodies. A familiar perfume of frontier refuge, lamplight cast flickering, amber shadows on the rough-hewn plank walls, glinting off the occasional Bowie knife tucked into a belt or the barrel of a holstered Colt. It was a typical Tuesday night, a scattering of grizzled prospectors, a few weary cattlemen, and a couple of drifters nursing their drinks, their laughter as coarse as their manners. And in the corner, by a scarred and battered upright piano that had likely seen better decades, sat Seraphina, Fina, as the saloon owner. A burly man named Gus called her, though she never responded to any name with more than a slight inclination of her head. Her fingers, surprisingly delicate and expressive, moved across the yellowed keys, coaxing a melody that was a world away from the raucous din around her. Tonight, it was a melancholic folk tune, a lament filled with a quiet sorrow that seemed to seep into the very timbers of the saloon, though few of the patrons consciously noted its passage, attributing any sudden pang of nostalgia to the whiskey or the weather. Fina might have been in her late 20s, or perhaps early 30s. Hardship had a way of blurring the edges of a woman's years. Her dress was a simple, dark wool, practical and mended, allowing her arms freedom as she played. Her dark hair, thick and wavy, was pulled back from her face in a simple knot at the nape of her neck, though errant tendrils often escaped to brush against her cheek as she swayed with the music. Her face, pale in the dim light, was usually held in an expression of serene concentration. Her eyes often closed as if the music were a private vision. She never sang, never spoke. Gus would chalk up her drink orders on a small slate she kept beside the piano. Music was her only utterance, her sole communion with a world that had, by all accounts, dealt her a cruel hand. The story whispered around Redemption Gulch was that she'd lost her entire family in a fire, or perhaps an Indian raid. The details varied with the teller, and the horror of it had stolen her voice. It was into this pocket of strained warmth and fleeting solace that Maverick Finn stumbled, the guitar case in his hand as much a part of him as his own shadow. He was a man made of long trails and longer memories, his face weathered by sun and wind, his eyes holding the kind of weariness that came from seeing too much of the world and too little of its kindness. His duster was coated with a fresh layer of snow, his dark hair, longer than was fashionable, damp against his collar. He was heading for the bar, for the promise of a shot of rye to cut the chill from his bones, when the music stopped him. It wasn't just the notes, though they were played with a skill that was startling in such a place. It was the feeling woven through them, a raw, aching loneliness that resonated deep within his own chest, striking a chord he thought had long since gone silent. He'd once played halls where men wore silk cravats and women dripped with jewels, his name a whisper on appreciative lips before the fall. Before the years of aimless drifting. He knew music, and the woman at the piano knew its soul. He found an empty table near the back, brushing snow from his shoulders, his gaze fixed on Fina. He watched her hands, the graceful dance of her fingers, the way her slight frame seemed to pour all its energy into the keys. The melody shifted, moving into a classical piece he vaguely recognized, something by Chopin, perhaps, but played with an undercurrent of fierce, untamed grief that no concert hall would have understood. The contrast between the delicate beauty of the music and the rough-hewn nature of its surroundings was almost painful. When she finally paused, her hands resting lightly on the keys as if reluctant to break the connection, Maverick felt an unfamiliar compulsion. He pushed himself up from the table and walked towards her, his worn boots making little sound on the sawdust-strewn floor. "Ma'am," he began, his voice a little rough from the cold and disuse. That was truly something. Haven't heard playing like that in a long time. Fina turned her head, her eyes, large and dark, meeting his. They were startlingly clear, like deep pools, and held a flicker of surprise. A small, almost hesitant smile touched her lips, but she said nothing. She made a slight gesture towards her throat, then shook her head gently, a look of faint regret in her eyes. Maverick frowned, a beat of incomprehension, then a slow dawning. You don't speak." She shook her head again, then reached for the small slate. With a piece of chalk, she wrote, in a neat, surprisingly elegant script, "The music speaks for me." He read it, a lump forming in his own throat. He looked at her again, truly seeing her now. The vulnerability behind the composure, the immense strength it must take to pour out her soul in such a place, night after night, without a word. "I understand," he said, and the surprising thing was, he truly did. He knew about locked-away pain, about finding solace in the 6 strings of his guitar when words failed or were too dangerous. An idea, bold and unexpected, sparked within him. He gestured towards his guitar case, then to the piano, an unspoken question in his eyes. "May I?" A different light flickered in Fina's eyes now. Curiosity, perhaps a hint of cautious interest. She hesitated for only a moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a slight upward tilt of her chin. The few patrons still paying attention watched with bemused interest as Maverick unstrapped his worn leather guitar case and drew out an old, well-loved Gibson. He didn't sit, but stood near the piano, tuning a string, then another, the familiar ritual calming his nerves. He looked at Fina, a silent invitation. She turned back to the piano, her fingers hovering over the keys. Then she began to play, not one of the mournful pieces from before, but a simple, searching melody, a question posed in notes. Maverick listened for a few bars, his head tilted. Then, with a soft smile, he joined in. His guitar didn't overpower her piano, but wove around it, a warm, resonant voice finding harmony with hers. He picked up her questioning phrase and answered it with a chord progression that was both hopeful and touched with a lingering wistfulness. Fina's eyes widened slightly. She looked at him, truly looked, and he saw a spark of something akin to wonder. She responded to his chords, her piano notes like silver rain against the rich timbre of his guitar. They improvised, a delicate dance of melody and harmony, neither leading, both following, creating something new in the smoky air of the Rusty Spur Saloon. It was a conversation without words, a meeting of 2 bruised souls finding a common language in the heart of a frozen wilderness. The clatter of glasses seemed to dim, the rough laughter to fade. For those few minutes, there was only the music, a fragile, beautiful thing born of silence and shared sorrow, a promise that even in the deepest winter, connection could still bloom, true to the unspoken promise that had bloomed between them in their first shared melody. Maverick Finn returned to the Rusty Spur Saloon the next night, And the night after that, the biting Dakota winter showed no signs of relenting. If anything, the wind howled with a sharper edge, and fresh snow often blanketed Redemption Gulch by morning, muffling the already sparse sounds of the frontier town. Each evening, Maverick would shake the cold from his duster, nod to Gus, the burly saloon owner, and find his quiet corner, the old Gibson guitar resting against his knee. It wasn't just any guitar. It was his younger brother's, Liam's. The wood was scarred and worn in places, imbued with the phantom touch of Liam's fingers, a constant, aching reminder of a life cut tragically short. For years, Maverick hadn't been able to truly play it, not beyond the absent-minded strumming of a man lost in his own desolate thoughts. His own music had died with Liam, but now, watching Fina at the piano, something was stirring. He'd find himself absently sketching notes on a scrap of paper Gus provided. A melody fragment here, a chord progression there, sparked by the way Fina's hands moved, the emotion she poured into the keys. Her music was a key, slowly turning the rusted lock on his own dormant creativities. As the nights unfolded, Maverick began to listen with more than just a musician's ear. He started to perceive the narrative woven into Fina's playing. When her fingers flew across the keys in a flurry of agitated, almost dissonant chords, he sensed a frantic terror, a desperate flight. When she played a piece so heartbreakingly tender, it made his own chest ache. He felt an unbearable loss, a yearning for something precious and irrevocably gone. A lullaby, played with such profound sorrow, would conjure images of a cradle, now empty, he realized, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that Fina wasn't just performing. She was recounting her life, her trauma, her unspeakable grief, through the only voice she had left. Each chord was a word, each melody a sentence in the story of her fractured past. He learned, through a few carefully chosen, respectful words with Gus, who guarded Fina's history like a protective hound, that she had indeed come from an orphanage further east. Music had been her refuge there, a structured solace taught by a kind, elderly nun. It had been her only constant, the single thread that had held her together when the world, and her family, had been consumed by a horror no one in Redemption Gulch knew the full truth of. Only its devastating consequence, her silence, the polished, almost classical precision in some of her phrasing, now made a poignant kind of sense. One particularly bitter night, when the saloon was nearly empty, the wind rattling the window panes like an angry spirit, Fina played a piece that was so suffused with desolation it felt like the cry of a soul utterly alone. When she finished, her shoulders were slumped, her head bowed, as if the effort had drained her completely. Maverick waited a few moments, the silence heavy between them, broken only by the crackle of the stove. He began to play, very softly, a simple, mournful air on Liam's guitar, a half-forgotten tune they used to play together. Fina lifted her head, her dark eyes finding his, questioning, yet profoundly understanding. He took a ragged breath. "This guitar," he began, his voice low, the words feeling rusty and hard-won. "It was my brother's, Liam. He was younger than me, full of music, full of life." He paused, the old pain, a familiar tightness in his chest. "We used to play together, had a small show, traveling around. Nothing grand, but it was ours." He looked down at the guitar, his fingers tracing the worn fretboard. There was an accident, a faulty gas lamp on a makeshift stage. A fire. His voice cracked. "It happened so fast. I tried to get to him, but the smoke, the flames." He shook his head, the images still vivid, still searing. "I pulled him out, but it was too late. And I was the older one. I should have checked that lamp. I should have." He couldn't finish. The guilt was a leaden weight he'd carried for years, a self-blame that had silenced his own music, his own joy. Fina watched him, her expression full of a deep, sorrowful empathy that needed no words. She reached out a hand, not to touch him, but a gentle, understanding gesture in the space between them. Then, she turned back to the piano and began to play. Not a lament, but a soft, almost tentative melody, like the first rays of dawn after a long, dark night. It was a sound of comfort, of shared sorrow, yet with a flicker of resilience woven through it. He met her gaze, saw the understanding there. She knew about fire, about loss, about the silence that follows tragedy, and in her eyes, there was no judgment, only a profound, shared humanity. Slowly, hesitantly, Maverick began to pick out a harmony to her melody, his guitar notes blending with her piano. It was the beginning of something new. Over the next few nights, in the quiet hours after most patrons had stumbled out into the cold, they began to weave their separate threads of music and memory together. One might start with a phrase, a musical question born of their individual pain, and the other would answer, building upon it, transforming it. He brought his fragmented melodies, the ghosts of songs he thought he'd forgotten. She offered her profound emotional depth, her intuitive understanding of harmony and counterpoint. They were co-writing, not with words on a page, but with notes in the air, their shared experiences of loss and survival becoming the foundation of their compositions. There was a raw honesty to their musical conversations, a vulnerability that neither had allowed themselves with another living soul. Through this collaborative alchemy, a particular piece began to take shape. It started with a haunting piano motif from Fina, full of her characteristic sorrow, but also a thread of searching. Maverick answered it with a guitar melody that was both a lament for his brother and a response to her call, a sound that acknowledged the darkness but refused to be entirely consumed by it. They worked on it, night after night, the music growing, evolving. It was a piece that spoke of their individual pasts, the crushing weight of unspoken grief, the isolation, but it also spoke of the tentative, fragile connection they were forging, a quiet understanding that transcended the need for words. One evening, when they played it through, the melody soared, poignant and powerful, a perfect marriage of piano and guitar, of his resonant chords and her crystalline notes. Gus, wiping down the bar, stopped his work, listening, his gruff face unusually still. The last notes faded into a silence that felt sacred, charged with emotion. Fina turned to Maverick, her eyes shining, a rare, luminous smile gracing her lips. She reached for her slate and chalked 2 words. "It is done." Maverick looked at the notes he'd scribbled down, the framework of their creation. He picked up the chalk and, beneath her words, he wrote the title that had been forming in his mind, a title that encapsulated everything they had shared, everything they had poured into the music, unspoken, in the heart of a desolate winter, in a dusty frontier saloon. 2 silent souls had found not only a voice, but a song, uniquely their own, a testament to the enduring power of music to heal the oldest, deepest wounds. The melody of Unspoken, born from shared sorrow and tentative hope, had become a quiet anthem within the rough-hewn walls of the rusty Spur Saloon. Night after night, as the relentless Dakota winter clawed at the edges of Redemption Gulch, Fina's piano and Maverick's guitar wove their intricate, wordless tales. Patrons grew accustomed to the spell they cast. Even the rowdiest prospector would sometimes fall silent, nursing his drink, caught in the poignancy of their music. For Fina and Maverick, these hours were a sanctuary, a space where old wounds were gently lulled, if not entirely healed. But peace, in places like Redemption Gulch, was often a fleeting guest. The first shadow fell in the portly, ostentatious form of Silas Blackwood, owner of the Gilded Cage, the larger, Gautier Saloon at the other end of town. Blackwood was a man whose smile never quite reached his cold. Calculating eyes, he wore a silk vest even in the dead of winter, a diamond stickpin winking from his cravat like a malevolent star. He'd heard whispers of the mute pianist and the soulful guitarist at the Rusty Spur, and his interest was piqued, not by the artistry, but by the potential for profit. One afternoon, he swaggered into the Rusty Spur, the scent of bay rum and expensive cigars preceding him. Gus, the saloon's owner, met him with a stony glare. Fina was idly running scales on the piano, the sound like wind chimes in the otherwise quiet room. Maverick was mending a strap on his guitar case by the cold stove. "Gus, my good man," Blackwood boomed, his voice overly cordial, "just came to make your lovely songbird an offer. The Gilded Cage could provide a grander stage, proper attire, a discerning clientele." His gaze slid towards Fina, oily and appraising. A talent like hers deserves more than this rustic establishment. Fina's hands stilled on the keys. Maverick's head came up sharply. His eyes narrowed. "She ain't a songbird, Blackwood," Gus growled, stepping between the larger man and Fina. "And she ain't for sale or for poaching. She's comfortable here." "Comfortable," Blackwood chuckled, a dismissive sound. "Comfort doesn't fill the coffers. My dear Gus, think about it. Girl," he addressed Fina directly, ignoring her muteness. "More coin than you'd see here in a year." He flicked a card onto the piano. "My offer stands." With another proprietary glance at Fina, he turned and left, leaving a chill in the air. Maverick's hand tightened on the leather strap he was mending. "Vulture?" he muttered, his gaze following Blackwood out the door. He looked at Fina. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a familiar, hunted look he was coming to despise. The second shadow arrived more subtly, a specter from Maverick's own haunted past. A few days later, as Maverick was leaving the general store, a lean, gray-faced man in a nondescript bowler hat stepped out from the alleyway. His suit was neat, but worn, and his eyes had the detached, observant quality of a man who had seen too much of the law's grimmer side. "Maverick Finn?" the man asked, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. Maverick tensed. "Who's asking?" "Name's Harrows. Used to be with the Pinkertons." Harrows's gaze was unnervingly direct. "I was in Evansville, back in '68. Remember a stage fire at the old Empire Theater. A young guitarist, Liam Finn." Tragic. The blood drained from Maverick's face. The snow-covered street, the biting wind, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. It all faded. He was back in the smoke. The screams, Liam's name, a raw tear in his throat. "What do you want?" Maverick's voice was a hoarse whisper. "Just revisiting old files," Harrows said smoothly, though there was an implied threat beneath the surface. "Negligence leading to fatality. It's a serious charge. Some folks were never quite satisfied with how that investigation closed. A man with your particular talents, lying low out here, makes one wonder." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Redemption Gulch isn't as far from civilization as some might think. Be a shame for old ghosts to come calling officially." Without another word, Harrows tipped his hat and melted back into the shadows of the alley, leaving Maverick rooted to the spot, the old guilt and a fresh, cold fear coiling in his gut. The world, which had briefly seemed to hold a fragile promise of peace, was closing in, but it was Fina who faced the next direct peril. The thaw had begun, turning the streets into a morass of mud and slush, making even short errands an ordeal. One bleak afternoon, while fetching a tin of tea for Gus from the general store, Fina witnessed a brutal altercation. Pike, a known town ruffian with a swaggering, mean-spirited demeanor, a nephew, some said, to old Jedediah, though the trapper claimed no kinship with his brutish ways, was viciously beating a smaller, older man over a perceived slight. Pike's face was contorted with rage, his fists landing with sickening thuds. Fina froze, her hand flying to her mouth. A silent gasp caught in her throat. Pike, sensing eyes on him, looked up, his gaze, cold and venomous, locking onto hers. He saw her, saw the horror on her face. He gave the older man one last kick, then slowly straightened, a cruel smirk twisting his lips as he stared directly at Fina. He didn't say a word, but his message was clear. You saw nothing. Trembling, Fina turned and fled back towards the rusty spur, her heart hammering against her ribs. Pike was dangerous, vindictive, and she knew, with chilling certainty, that he would not forget she had been a witness. That night, after Fina had conveyed her terror to Maverick through hurried, agitated gestures and wide, frightened eyes, his carefully constructed composure finally broke. The threats were converging. Blackwood's avarice, Harrow's shadowy menace, and now Pike's direct, physical threat to Fina. We have to leave, Fina, he said, his voice urgent, his hands gripping her shoulders gently. This place, it's not safe. Not anymore. We can go west, California maybe, or north. Find somewhere quiet, where no one knows us. The old instinct to run, to escape the past and its relentless pursuit, surged through him. He couldn't bear the thought of anything happening to her. Not after Liam, not after everything. Fina looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and a surprising, steely resolve. She pulled away gently and reached for her slate. Her hand trembled as she wrote, but the letters were firm, decisive. No more running. Maverick. She looked up at him, her gaze intense. This is my home now. You are here. Gus is here. The music. It is here. She paused, then wrote again, her chalk strokes emphatic. I will not let them silence me again. Maverick stared at the words, a knot of fear and admiration tightening in his chest. He saw not the timid, traumatized woman he'd first encountered, but someone who had found a core of strength within her silent world. Then, an idea sparked in her eyes. She picked up the chalk, a new energy in her movements. We will play, she wrote, one night, a proper performance, not just for the Rusty Spur, but for anyone in Redemption Gulch who will listen. Our music, unspoken. She underlined the title, then looked at him, her expression a fierce question, a challenge, a plea. It will be my answer, my voice, a final performance, a declaration. Maverick understood. It was a gamble, a defiant stand against the encroaching shadows. It could draw more unwanted attention, or it could, just possibly, be the very thing that allowed them to claim their peace, their place, their song, in this hard, unforgiving land. What did you think of today's story? If it made your day, drop a good in the comments. If it didn't hit the mark, just type 1. Got your own thoughts? I'd love to hear them below. And hey, don't forget to hit subscribe. It's free, and it really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for being here. The chosen venue was an old, abandoned livery stable at the edge of Redemption Gulch. Its vast, dusty interior smelling faintly of hay and forgotten journeys. Gus, with a surprising resourcefulness, had rallied a few of the town's steadier hands. They'd swept the packed earth floor, hung lanterns from the high rafters that cast a warm, flickering glow against the rough-hewn timbers, and arranged rough benches and borrowed chairs. It was still cold, the late winter air seeping through the cracks in the walls, but a potbelly stove roared valiantly in one corner, and a sense of hushed anticipation filled the makeshift concert hall. Fina and Maverick had placed her piano, moved with considerable effort by Gus and a team of volunteers, near the center, Maverick's chair and guitar beside it. Word had spread through Redemption Gulch like a slow thaw. Some came out of curiosity, others out of a genuine affection for the mute pianist and the quiet guitarist who had brought an unexpected beauty to the rough-edged nights at the Rusty Spur. Fina, dressed in a simple dark blue gown Gus's wife had helped her freshen, her dark hair adorned with a single velvet ribbon, looked small and almost fragile beside the piano, but her eyes held a steady, resolute light. Maverick, in his cleanest worn shirt, his late brother Liam's guitar, polished to a soft sheen, felt the familiar weight of its history. But tonight, it was overlaid with a new sense of purpose. He scanned the crowd, noting Silas Blackwood near the back, his arms crossed, a smirk on his face. Pike, the town ruffian, lurked in the shadows near the entrance, his eyes fixed on Fina with a predatory gleam. And Harrows, the man from Maverick's past, stood unobtrusively by a support beam, a silent, ominous presence. The air was thick, not just with cold, but with unspoken threats. Then, Fina's fingers touched the keys, and a hush fell. Maverick joined in, his guitar weaving a path around her melody. They began with a few simpler tunes, familiar folk songs that warmed the room, then transitioned into the intricate, emotional landscape of Unspoken. The music swelled, filling the cavernous space, telling their story without a single word. The sorrow, the loss, the flickering hope, the quiet strength found in shared silence. Fina played with an intensity Maverick had never seen. Her whole being poured into the notes, her eyes often closed, her face a canvas of profound emotion. Maverick, watching her, played with a depth of feeling that resonated in every chord. His guitar, a voice answering hers. The audience was rapt, transported. Even the most hardened faces softened, caught in the raw, honest beauty of their creation. It was during a particularly poignant, quiet passage of Unspoken, when the melody hung suspended, fragile as spun glass, that Fina's eyes flickered open. She saw it. Pike, detaching himself from the shadows, beginning to move stealthily along the wall, his intent clear in his menacing posture. At the same moment, from the other side, two of Blackwood's known cronies began to advance, their purpose less clear but undoubtedly nefarious. Fina's breath caught, but her fingers never faltered. Instead, the delicate melody fractured, a sudden, sharp, dissonant chord crashing through the quiet. The prearranged signal, their secret alarm woven into the fabric of their music. Maverick's head snapped up. His eyes met Fina's, instantly understanding the terror and the warning in her gaze. He saw Pike, saw Blackwood's men. The music died abruptly. Fina, he yelled, kicking his chair back, moving to place himself between her and the advancing Pike. Well, now, seems the concert's over. Pike sneered. Lunging for Fina, Maverick intercepted him, a lifetime of regret, and a fierce, protective instinct fueling his movements. They grappled, stumbling amongst the benches, the crowd gasping, scattering. Blackwood's men used the diversion to try and grab Fina from the other side. Not so fast, roared Gus, appearing as if from nowhere, a stout hickory stick in his hand. He laid into one of the thugs, while old Jedediah, surprisingly spry, tripped the other. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Stay where you are. Finn, a cold voice cut through the uproar. Harrows stepped forward, his hand inside his coat. You're a wanted man. Don't make this worse. Maverick, having momentarily subdued Pike with a well-aimed punch, found himself frozen between protecting Fina and facing this ghost from his past. The townsfolk, shocked into silence, looked from the brawl to Harrows, then to Maverick. This was it, the moment of reckoning. Taking a deep breath, Maverick turned to face not just Harrows, but the entire assembly. His voice, when he spoke, was raw with emotion, but steady, "My name is Maverick Finn," he began, his gaze sweeping over the stunned faces. "And it's true, there's a shadow on my past." He told them then, simply, starkly, about Liam, about the fire, about the guilt he'd carried like a shroud for years. "I was careless. I was responsible for my brother's death. Not a day goes by. I don't blame myself." His voice broke, but he pressed on. "I ran from it for years. But here, in Redemption Gulch, listening to Fina, making music with her, I started to feel like maybe a man can find his way back, even from that kind of darkness." He looked directly at Harros. "If there's a price to pay for my past, I'll pay it, but not before I make sure she—" He gestured to Fina, who stood pale but resolute by her piano, "is safe from these vultures." A murmur ran through the crowd. They had heard the pain in his voice, seen his courage in defending Fina. They had been touched by their music. Silas Blackwood, seeing his plan unraveling and his thugs subdued, tried to bluster. "This is nonsense. That woman should be singing for me. She's an asset." "She ain't an asset, Blackwood. She's a person." Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, cried out, her voice trembling with indignation. "And that music, it was a gift to us all." Pike, nursing a split lip, tried to rise, but Jedediah planted a heavy boot on his chest. "You stay put. Varmint, we all saw what you were about." Harrows looked around at the determined faces of the townspeople, at Gus standing guard over Fina, at Maverick, vulnerable yet unbowed. He saw no support for his cold justice here. His authority, whatever it was, seemed to wither in the warmth of their unexpected solidarity. He slowly withdrew his hand from his coat. "Empty, perhaps," he said, his voice tight. "Some ghosts are best left undisturbed." He turned and walked out of the livery, disappearing into the cold night. Blackwood, realizing the tide had turned irrevocably against him, made a sputtering attempt to defend himself. But Gus, backed by a crowd of suddenly emboldened settlers, simply pointed towards the door. "Get out, Blackwood, and don't come back. Your kind ain't welcome here when real folks are trying to make a stand." Sheepish and enraged, Blackwood and his remaining bruised men retreated. Pike was unceremoniously hauled off by a few of the sterner townsmen, who promised to see him well on his way out of their territory by morning. In the sudden quiet, Fina walked over to Maverick. She reached out and gently touched his arm, her eyes shining with tears, but also with an immense pride and gratitude. She then turned to the crowd, her gaze sweeping over them, and offered a slow, graceful bow. A silent thank you. Maverick looked at the faces around him, no longer suspicious or indifferent, but filled with a shared understanding, a communal forgiveness. The weight on his soul felt lighter. He turned back to Fina, a tentative smile touching his lips. He offered her his hand. She took it. Together, they walked back to the piano and the guitar. The lanterns still flickered, the stove still hummed, and in the heart of that dusty, transformed livery stable, surrounded by the flawed but fundamentally decent people of Redemption Gulch, Fina and Maverick began to play again. Not unspoken, this time, but something new, something softer, a melody that spoke of trials faced, of forgiveness found, and of a future, once unimaginable, now tentatively dawning. The music, their true voice, had spoken, and in its speaking, had brought not just healing, but a quiet, resilient triumph. The morning Fina and Maverick rode out of Redemption Gulch, a pale spring sun was finally winning its battle against the long, hard winter. The muddy streets were firming, and the prairie beyond the town limits shimmered with the first iridescent green of new grass. Gus, his gruff face softened with an emotion he tried to hide, pressed a sack of provisions into Maverick's hand Jedediah gave Fina a small, awkwardly carved wooden flower, its petals surprisingly delicate. The townsfolk who had witnessed their stand, who had been moved by their music and their courage, offered quiet nods and heartfelt wishes for safe travels. There were no grand farewells, just the sincere, understated goodwill of a community that had, in its own way, been redeemed alongside them. They traveled light Fina's small carpet bag, Maverick's bedroll and guitar, and a sturdy, canvas-covered wagon Gus had helped them procure, which carefully cradled the precious, upright piano. Tucked safely away was their growing collection of handwritten music, the melodies of Unspoken, and the newer tunes that were beginning to blossom between them. They didn't have a set destination, only a shared sense of purpose, to carry their music, their story, out into the wider world. Their path unspooled across the vast canvas of the West. They played in dusty saloons, much like the Rusty Spur, in hushed church halls where the collection plate was their only payment, and sometimes under the vast, star-dusted canopy of the prairie sky for circles of wide-eyed homesteaders grateful for any diversion from the solitude. Maverick's voice, once used only for terse replies or mournful songs sung to himself, began to open up, not in speech so much as in the introductions he'd offer to their pieces, explaining with a quiet dignity that Fina's truest voice was in her fingers, in the heart-stopping beauty of her music. Fine's, beside him, would offer a shy, gentle smile, her dark eyes conveying a warmth that needed no words. One sun-drenched afternoon, they found themselves at a remote mission orphanage, a collection of adobe buildings nestled in a shallow valley. The matron, a stern-faced woman with kind eyes, welcomed their offer of an afternoon concert with weary gratitude. The children, a motley group of all ages, their faces etched with stories too harsh for their years, gathered in the small, whitewashed chapel. As Fina began to play, a gentle, searching melody, Maverick noticed a small girl, no more than 6, with wide, haunted eyes, huddled in the back. Like Fina, she was silent, watching, but with an almost painful intensity. When Fina's music swelled, a particularly tender passage from Unspoken, the little girl gasped, a tiny, soundless exhalation. After the formal playing, Fina, drawn by an invisible thread, moved to sit beside the child. She didn't try to speak, but gently took the girl's small hand and led her to the piano. She placed the child's fingers on the keys, then covered them with her own, pressing down softly, producing a single, clear note. The little girl flinched, then looked up at Fina, a flicker of something, curiosity, recognition, in her vacant eyes. For the next hour, Fina talked to the child through the piano, simple call and response melodies, rhythmic patterns, sometimes just single, resonant chords. Slowly, tentatively, the little girl began to press the keys herself, her small face alight with a dawning understanding. It wasn't speech, not yet, but it was communication, a bridge built note by note across a chasm of silence. Maverick watched, his heart swelling, witnessing Fina's profound gift for empathy, her ability to reach a wounded soul where words had failed. He saw not just a musician, but a healer. Their reputation, whispered from one small town to the next, eventually reached ears further afield. In a bustling railhead town in Colorado, a dapper gentleman in a city suit approached Maverick after a particularly stirring performance in a crowded hotel lobby. He was a promoter, an old acquaintance from Maverick's former life, and he made an offer that would have once been Maverick's dream. A concert tour, proper venues, handsome pay, a chance to reclaim the fame he'd lost. Maverick listened politely, the ghost of old ambitions stirring faintly. He looked over at Fina, who was quietly packing away their sheet music, her presence a steady anchor in his world. He thought of the little girl at the orphanage, of the hushed, reverent faces of homesteaders listening under the stars, of the quiet peace he found each night playing beside this silent, extraordinary woman. "It's a generous offer, Mr. Harrison," Maverick said, his voice calm and certain. "But my partner and I, we have a different path we're following. Our music seems to find its home in quieter places." He extended his hand. "Thank you." Though Harrison, surprised but discerning, simply nodded. "I understand. Finn, some melodies aren't meant for the grand halls." That night, in their small rented room above a mercantile, Maverick was unusually quiet, staring out at the moonlit street, the promoter's offer perhaps weighing on him more than he let on. Fina watched him, a familiar fear tightening her chest. The fear of being left, of the silence returning, not just hers, but the shared silence between them that had become so precious. He looked so distant, so lost in thought. She imagined him on a grand stage, the roar of applause, a life she couldn't fully share. He sighed, turning from the window, a weary look on his face. He started to say something, perhaps to reassure her, but before he could, Fina reached out, her small hand gripping his arm with surprising strength. Her lips trembled. Her eyes, wide and luminous in the dim light, were fixed on his, and then a sound, a breath, a word, rasped from her throat, a sound she hadn't uttered in years, a sound so fragile it was almost carried away by the silence. "Stay." Maverick froze. He stared at her, his heart seeming to stop. Had he heard it, or had he willed it? Tears welled in Fina's eyes as she saw the shock, the dawning wonder on his face. She nodded, a small, jerky movement, as if to confirm the miracle. "Stay," she whispered again, the sound a little stronger this time. A plea, a prayer, a declaration. He sank to his knees before her, taking her hands in his own eyes now wet. "Fina." He breathed, his voice thick with emotion. I wasn't going anywhere. Not without you. Never." He didn't ask how or why now. It didn't matter. The word itself was a gift beyond measure, a melody more profound than any they had ever composed. They continued their journey. Two nomadic artists. Their wagon, a familiar sight on the dusty roads and burgeoning rail lines of the growing West. Fina didn't suddenly become talkative. "Stay" was a precious, guarded jewel, and other words came slowly, hesitantly, like shy wildflowers after a long winter. But her true voice, the one that soared and wept and rejoiced, remained in her music, now even richer, even deeper, intertwined with Maverick's guitar and his quietly supportive presence. They played in mining camps and schoolhouses, for congregations and lonely shepherds, their music a balm for weary souls, a spark of beauty in hard lives. And as they traveled, their story traveled with them, passed along by those they'd touched. It grew with each telling, burnished by time and distance, until it became a kind of legend, the tale of the mute pianist who spoke through ivory keys, and the haunted guitarist who found his redemption in her silent strength. They were the stuff of fireside tales, a testament to a love that needed no grand pronouncements, a symphony composed not just of notes, but of two fractured souls made whole, their melodies echoing across the vast, open heart of the American West, a timeless ballad of healing and hope. What did this story stir in you? Was it the silence? The music? The kind of love that doesn't need words? I'd love to hear what parts hit you hardest or stayed with you longest. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters more than you think. And if these stories speak to something in you, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one.